Hey, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining this morning's Beef Brunch Educational Series webinar. My name is Ashley Edwards, and our speaker today is Dr. Ed Twidwell. Dr. Twidwell is a professor in the LSU School of Plant, Environmental, and Soil Sciences and serves as one of our forage specialists for the LSU AgCenter. Today, he's going to be talking about management options for your late summer forages. A few housekeeping notes before I turn it over to Dr. Twidwell. Your microphones are muted, so we ask that you please keep those muted through the webinar. If you're joining us online through the Teams app or link, you should see a Q&A box that you can enter your questions into. You can put those questions in at any time during the presentation. If you're calling in and listening to us through your phone, you can text your questions to me. My number is 512-818-5476. So again, if you're calling in, you can text questions to me throughout the webinar. That number is 512-818-5476. In the interest of time, we are going to wait to answer your questions at the end of the presentation. So with that, Dr. Twidwell, thank you for taking your time to be with us this morning. You should be able to begin whenever you're ready.
Okay, well, thanks so much, Ashley. Appreciate the opportunity to visit with everyone this morning. And obviously, this year has been a very strange year with regards to weather. I know some areas of the state have had over 60 inches of rain so far, and some areas may have even more than that. So definitely been an issue with regards to the amount of rain we've had. So how does all this rain affect our pasture? Well, if you go back into the spring, we had some relatively cool temperatures and rainy conditions in April and May, and that really favored the cool season species such as annual ryegrass. I know I had calls from quite a few producers who were saying my warm season grasses just really aren't growing very well. And I think what was happening was with all the rainy conditions, we had a lot of cloud cover, and the warm season species just were kind of delayed in growth. So our summer grasses were a little bit slow coming on. Overall, though, the rainfall has been pretty good for pasture productivity. A lot of producers haven't had to fertilize their pastures very much this summer, or in some cases been too wet to fertilize at all. But really, this time of year, our pastures look very good, and there's adequate soil moisture in most parts of the state headed into the fall. So it looks considerably different this year than in most August. Now for hay production, that's a totally different situation. These rainy conditions have really severely impacted hay production. We've got some producers that are just now taking their first cutting. Others have been fortunate enough that they had a window earlier this summer where they could take a cutting, but overall their hay supplies are pretty short at this point in time. Also, most of our hay fields have not been properly fertilized due to the wet conditions. And also, most of the hay that is currently being cut is being cut way later than it normally is, so it's overly mature. And that leads us into the quality versus yield situation. And we're heading now towards the right part of that graph there, where we got a lot of tonnage out there, but our quality is not necessarily all that good. Now, this is just some data on some cool season grasses, but kind of reinforces what I just showed, that as the plants mature and go into more of a reproductive stage, their TDM declines, and also the hay intake by livestock also declines. And I'm afraid what we're heading into this winter is we're going to have a lot of overly mature hay, and the animals may not be able to intake as much as they normally would. So you're probably looking at trying to supplement this hay with some type of protein or energy supplementation. And this is an example with Bermudagrass. Again, the older the Bermudagrass is, the lower in TDN and protein it is compared to Bermudagrass that's cut a little bit earlier. Now, been getting a lot of questions on rain damage on hay quality. People have put some hay down. It's been rained on maybe once or even twice. What effect does rain have on hay quality? Now, most of the research that's been done on rain damage has been done with alfalfa. So I'm going to show this. The effects on grass hay probably aren't quite as dramatic, but this is the most research we have is with alfalfa. And if you just compare the well-cured hay versus rain damaged hay, you can see the yield is decreased by about 10 percentage units. And also the digestibility is decreased by about 7 or 8 percentage units. So basically what happens is that rain leaches out all the soluble nutrients in the hay. So you're basically left with just the skeleton of the plant. In other words, you're going to have a lot of fiber left. Now, the protein content may not necessarily be all that different because protein is bound pretty tightly to the cell wall. So the protein content may not be affected that much, but the TDN is definitely going to be affected pretty substantially. And again, with grass hay, you probably don't have quite as dramatic effect as you do with the alfalfa, but it's still going to be decreased some. Now, these rainy weather conditions have really increased the interest among producers in trying to produce baleage this year. Now, when we're talking about baleage, what we're really talking about is trying to produce baleage on our high quality crops. Like annual ryegrass is probably the major crop where we're going to be using baleage. Putting up annual ryegrass, we typically do that in mid-April to early May. It's a good time of year. Weather conditions are fairly cool. And annual ryegrass has a high amount of soluble sugars. Some of our summer forages like Bermudas and the millets and sorghums, they can make decent baleage, but the fermentation conditions are just a lot more variable during the summer. We have hot, humid weather, and typically these summer forages don't work quite as well as annual ryegrass. But when we're talking about baleage, we're talking about making a fairly wet product in a neighborhood of about 45 to 60% moisture for baling. And of course, the big advantage of producing baleage is you're able to get the material off the field a lot faster than if you are trying to make hay. With ryegrass, that can be an advantage of several days. And it can also provide less storage loss compared to silage, or it's much easier to handle than traditional silage. Some disadvantages. We need to have maintain an airtight seal. Oxygen getting into that system can cause some spoilage losses. You got to think about each bale of silage basically being a miniature silo. Each bale goes through a complete fermentation, so we need to keep oxygen out of the system. Some other disadvantages, you do have to have a wrapping machine. You have to have the cost of the plastic wrap, and there are some specific balers that will or will not work for producing baleage. So you may have to buy a new baler as well, or some attachments to put on your baler to even have this process work. And the other thing is this forage must be fed within 1 year. You really can't carry it over any longer than that. But for me, one of the biggest myths is that some producers think that just somehow wrapping will improve the quality, and that's completely false. So if you're wrapping very mature hay, it's not going to improve the quality of it. So kind of a junk in, junk out type of a scenario here. So again, when we're talking about or even thinking about using baleage, it's to be used for high quality forages, primarily ryegrass, and then maybe some of the summer forages like Bermudagrass or sorghum sedan grass. Now, as far as summer annuals go, I don't think there was a lot of acres planted of these crops this year because it was so wet. With these species, probably the most popular ones are sorghum sudan grass or pearl millet. And generally, if you have these crops, we recommend graze them when they reach a height of about 3-4 feet tall, and graze them down and leave a stubble height of about 6 to 8 inches. Now, one of the issues if you have the sorghum species is an issue with prussic acid. We can run into issues with it after we have a frost in the fall. Now, which plants parts are most toxic? Any new growth is going to have a higher level of prussic acid compared to the stems, or the older leaves are going to be relatively low in prussic acid. Also, if we have any new regrowth and any young tillers, they can be extremely toxic with regards to prussic acid. So if you have any sorghum species, prussic acid is really not a concern if you're harvesting for hay or silage, because once a plant is cut, that prussic acid dissipates into the atmosphere. And also, if they're frosted, the same thing happens. That prussic acid will be released over time. But really, the key is if you anticipate a hard frost coming, make sure you don't have the animals out there. Because they can die pretty quickly with prussic acid. So kind of a rule to follow is if you know a frost is coming, just remove the livestock for a period of about 1 week or so, and that'll allow the prussic acid to be released, and you can go back to grazing the sorghums again. Now, I mentioned there's probably not a lot of sorghum planted this year, but with all the rain, there's been a lot of Johnson grass that's just volunteer growing out there in a lot of pastures. And Johnson grass really is a pretty good forage. It's pretty palatable, but it does have the potential to also produce prussic acid poisoning. So if you're grazing Johnson grass this fall, that's fine, but just be aware that if a hard frost is coming, you need to pull them off of that Johnson grass for a week or so. Now, weeds have been a major issue this summer. I know Dr. Strahan last month talked about how to control all these different things. But really, the inclusion of some of these weed species like crabgrass and foxtail and things like that have really not been too bad for grazing. But if we have some of these grassy weeds in our hay, it's going to decrease our hay quality. So we highly recommend getting your hay tested this year, not only for the weeds, because you're likely to have some weeds in there, but also just because the quality may be kind of rank hay, so your quality may be a little bit low this year. Now, I'd also like to mention that we did reopen a forage testing lab on the LSU campus July 1st, so we're starting to get some samples sent into the lab. There's a website you can click on to get information on how to send in a sample, or just contact your local extension agent about hay sampling and testing. Now, I know producers have a lot of weeds out there. Can they be sprayed in August? And I've done quite a few meetings and field days with Dr. Strahan, and normally August is not a good time to spray. Normally, we recommend spraying for weeds about the 1st of June, but with our growth conditions this year, most of these weeds are kind of like our pastures. They're still pretty succulent and growing pretty well. So they should be able to take up the herbicides pretty well this year. So if you have some weeds you haven't been able to treat, we would say go ahead and treat them in August. They should be able to get a pretty good kill with your herbicide treatments this August. Again, this is kind of the exception rather than the rule, but this year, as I've mentioned earlier, has been kind of strange all year long. Of course, another issue we've been battling with is armyworms. Been a major insect pest this summer. Seemed like the infestation started early and they've continued so far. Now, a major issue we've seen is that the pyrethroid insecticides have not been working very well. And visiting with the AgCenter entomologists, they're not even recommending using them anymore for armyworm. It looks like the armyworms have developed some amount of resistance to these pyrethroid insecticides. So the entomologists are recommending using other products such as Dimilin or Intrepid, as they have better residual control. They seem to be working better, but they are more expensive. So producers need to kind of pencil that out. But you're going to have to keep monitoring these stands for infestation, not only in your summer grasses, but if you plant ryegrass early, you may have to keep an eye out on armyworms infesting those stands as well. I think it's going to be an ongoing issue until we get some cooler weather. Now, as far as diseases go, a common disease in hybrid Bermudagrass is Helminthosporium, which I have a picture of right there. We see that it's pretty common every year, especially on hybrid Bermudagrass fields where the potash levels might be a little bit low. When the potash levels get low, it puts the plants under stress and you start to get this Helminthosporium disease in your Bermudagrass. Now, another disease that had a few cases of this year is Rhizoctonia, or sheath blight on bahiagrass. And we have not seen this disease for quite a few years. Typically, this disease occurs because of some kind of stress. And the last time I remember having much of an issue with it was about 15 years ago when we were in drought conditions, kind of the exact opposite of what we're dealing with this year. But I think this year, with the excess water, bahiagrass really doesn't like wet conditions very well. So I think with the excess water, it put some stress on this bahiagrass, and we started seeing some issues with this sheath blight. If you look close at the plants, like the picture on the right-hand side there, you see some blotches on the leaf blades. And also from a field perspective, it'll start out, you'll see little circular areas of bahiagrass that start to die out, and those areas will just keep increasing. What can we do about these diseases? Well, unfortunately, there's not a whole lot we can do about them. There's no labeled fungicide for use on forage crops. If you have some diseased plants in a pasture, just try to graze them, or maybe just clip the area down to try to get rid of some of that leaf material. If they're in a hay field and you're anywhere close to time to cut, just go ahead and cut it for hay. Now, you may not have these issues next year. These diseases are very much influenced by environmental conditions, so we may or may not have these issues next year. Hopefully, we will not. Now, the late summer, early fall is a good time to take soil samples. You can go out and take them with a soil probe, or if you don't have a probe, just use a shovel or a spade. Try to do a good job of getting a random sample from an area. Maybe take 10, 15 different probes, put it in a plastic bucket, mix it together, and send it to a soil testing lab. For most of our forages that we're concerned about growing, we want the pH to be somewhere in the neighborhood of about 5.8 to 6.5. If your pH level is lower than this, you may need to add some lime to get that pH adjusted. And also check your nutrient levels for phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur. And I know that fertilizer prices are higher this year than they have been in previous years. So if the recommendations call for a high amount of some of these, you may want to put some amount of fertilizer out in the fall and maybe some out in the spring, just to spread out your cost. Now, I read an article just the other day. It indicated fertilizer prices in 2022 are likely to increase even more. So I don't think we're going to catch a break with fertilizer prices anytime soon. I know a lot of people are cutting hay right now. Hopefully there'll be some drier conditions in the fall, and hopefully you might be able to get at least one more cutting, maybe even two cuttings. So if you're cutting hay now, I would highly recommend that once the hay is off the field, go ahead and fertilize, and hopefully you get one good cutting and maybe even one good cutting and maybe even a second cutting. The yield may not be as high as you want, but I think there's going to be a lot of hay cut well into the fall months this year, just because hay supplies are so short right now. Hay is going to be a vital commodity heading into the winter. It's definitely a supply and demand type thing. We've got a high demand and low supply. Price is probably going to be a little higher than it has been in previous years. Now for pasture, there's still time for excellent growth from our summer grasses. This is the graph I have is just a growth pattern of in general for warm season grasses. And the arrow I have is basically where we're at now. And the growth rate may be starting to slow down a little bit as the daylight starts getting shorter and nighttime temperatures start cooling off a little. The growth rate on these warm season grasses is going to start declining, but we still have between now and probably about mid-October time frame as far as having a good period of time for some excellent growth. And I think producers really need to take advantage of that. So with our summer pastures, I think you really need to focus on trying to optimize that pasture resource from now until, say, mid-October or maybe even later. Because that's going to be your cheapest source of forage, rather than, again, we don't know what the price of hay is going to be. Likely it's going to be relatively high. So try to put the emphasis on maximizing your pasture resource. So normally don't recommend making a fertilizer application in August, because normally it's hot and dry and our pastures are kind of dried out this time of year. But again, in most situations, our forage grasses are in a pretty good state right now. So I think it'd be a pretty good idea to make a fertilizer application right now, about 50 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre, and try to push these grasses into the fall as much as possible in a productive state. And you may also want to consider using some type of a managed grazing system to try to utilize the forages you have in an efficient manner. Now, most people have a continuous grazing type of situation where they have one big pasture and the animals are free to graze what they want. And that's fine, but in that situation, you're probably not being the most efficient. You probably got some trampling and other type of wastage going on. So it may not be quite the most efficient way of grazing this fall. You may want to look at a specialized type of a stocking system. What this slide shows here is the same continuous grazing system, but that dotted line is electric fence. So if I have an electric fence, I can move that fence around, and I can either move it to shorten up the grazing area, or maybe move it the other direction to expand the grazing area. So what you can maybe do is take that electric fence and cut the pasture in half, and look at grazing half of the area, graze that area, and then move them to the other half and let the half you just grazed, give it a chance to recover. So you can flip-flop your grazing, or another option is to graze half of it and let the other half accumulate and cut that area for hay. So to me, using electric fencing does give you some flexibility and gives you a few more options rather than just using a continuous grazing system that I showed previously. Now, some of you may already have a rotational grazing system set up. If you do, that's fine. I would continue to use that. If you don't already have a system set up like this, I'm not sure I would go out and buy a lot of electric fencing and set up a system like this time of year. I'm not sure that's real cost effective. But you know, if you already have a rotational system in place, by all means use it, because I think it's going to be more efficient than a continuous system. Now, another practice we can discuss is stockpiling. Stockpiling basically refers to deferred growth of our summer perennial grasses. And from my perspective, it's somewhat of a risky practice. So I would not devote any more than about 15 to maybe 25% of my acreage to this practice. It's a little bit risky because we don't know what the conditions are going to be like in the fall. With stockpiling, what we want as far as weather conditions would be a pretty dry fall and a mild winter. Our worst case scenario is if it starts raining a lot, say in November. That's going to really curtail how much grazing we can get out of it. And for me, it probably works better in well-drained soils in the northern part of the state, from say Alexandria north. We start getting a little more rolling land. I think it probably works a little bit better than in South Louisiana, where we have a lot more of poorly drained soils. So the procedure for stockpiling is pretty simple. This time of year, you go out and clip your pasture area to a stubble height of about 2 inches in about mid-August, which is relatively soon, within the next week or so. And then you put out about 50 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre, and then you keep the animals off of that area until about mid-October. So basically what you're doing from say mid-August to mid-October, you're trying to stockpile grass, trying to stockpile as much growth out there as you can. And then when you get into mid-October, you can start grazing and try to graze as long as possible. And what most producers that do stockpiling use a strip grazing type of system, where you give them access to a certain amount of forage area per day. You're probably going to be looking at moving that electric fence every day or maybe every other day. And this is maybe a little better slide of what that shows, where the animals are grazing right now. And then the next day I may move that fence over into the area you can see that has more growth in it. But again, you're going to be moving that fairly frequently on a daily basis or every other day. So it's a little bit labor intensive. Now for stockpiling, continuous grazing just does not work very well because you just have too much trampling and waste going on. So I would not recommend doing continuous grazing with stockpiling. Now, several years ago, Dr. Scaglia, Dr. Gentry, and Jeff Gurry at the Dean Lee Station did some stockpiling work with Bermudagrass, and they followed just what I discussed. They clipped the pasture in mid-August, put out about 50 pounds of nitrogen, and then they went in and they took some clippings here, and I think they started grazing this in about mid-October. But you can see the crude protein and TDN values, say in October, are pretty good. You know, 11% protein, 57% TDN. you're going to be hard pressed to find hay of that quality. And they were able to graze up until January 23rd. You can see it as you get into the fall, the quality does decline some, but not terrible. But again, the issue with stockpiling, let's say we started getting a lot of rain in, say, mid-November. Well, that would pretty well shut down my stockpiling. As you get that stockpile forage gets wet, it's just going to mold and decay, and you're not going to get much use out of it. So again, you're kind of rolling the dice with stockpiling. Again, I wouldn't do this on maybe 20-25% of my acreage, just because there's quite a bit of risk involved. Now, the University of Arkansas has done a lot of work with stockpiled Bermudagrass over the years, and when we put all their data together, they calculated about a $20 per head savings in winter feed costs where producers use stockpiled Bermudagrass as opposed to not stockpiling Bermuda. So there are some cost savings involved. It is somewhat risky, and there is a good bit of labor involved because you do have to move the animals fairly frequently, but it might be something worth considering this year. Now, another option is to plant winter pastures. Winter pastures are very popular for beef cattle producers. Some advantages of planting winter pastures obviously gives us some grazing during the winter and spring months. Annual ryegrass especially is very high in nutritive quality, and it can decrease the dependence we have on stored forages and our protein and energy supplements. And it may be your most economical means of wintering your cow herd this winter. Some disadvantages, obviously, there's costs involved with seed, fuel, and fertilizer. It takes some time and labor to plant the winter annuals. You may or may not have the proper planting equipment. And generally with ryegrass, we have pretty good chance of success, but there's always the chance we may not get a good stand. So there are some disadvantages. Now, we've been getting a lot of questions on the status of annual ryegrass seed for this fall. Now, almost all of the ryegrass seed that's produced occurs in the Willamette Valley of Oregon. It's a beautiful area of the country, but that little map on the left shows where the Willamette Valley is in western Oregon. Now, this year, conditions were not conducive at all for grass seed production. Now, for annual ryegrass, they normally harvest that seed around the 1st of July. But Western Oregon had a very dry early and late spring, and also in June they had exceedingly high temperatures. I mean, for that part of the country, it's a pretty mild climate, and they had a week or so there where they had temperatures over 100 degrees. So heading into the ryegrass seed harvest, nobody really knew what kind of seed yields they were going to have. But when I got in there and started harvesting, they actually found that the seed yields for annual ryegrass were not too bad. They were lower than normal, but still there was a decent amount of seed that was harvested. The grasses that really got hammered were seed production of perennial ryegrass and tall fescue. Those yields were reduced more than 50%. Now, fortunately for us, we don't rely on tall fescue or perennial ryegrass. Those grasses are primarily grown in Kentucky and Virginia, North Carolina, and those areas. So livestock producers in those areas are going to be dramatically affected, and not only livestock producers, but they use tall fescue and perennial ryegrass seed in a lot of lawn mixes and ball fields and things like that. So at least for the annual ryegrass, seed industry, we do have some seed that's going to be available. So again, kind of a net result, the amount of seed to produce is lower than normal. So you're going to expect seed prices to be higher because it's kind of a supply and demand type thing. So there should be seed available, but some varieties may be limited in supply. And also it's going to be a while before the seed actually gets transported down to the Gulf Coast states. They're running into a lot of labor issues, just like everywhere else in the country. And this the grass seed production is pretty labor intensive. The producers have to harvest the seed. They have to take that seed to get it cleaned. And once it's clean, the seed goes to the warehouses of the different seed companies where they bag it up in the 50-pound bags. And then they have to take that seed to the rail and transport the seed down to the Gulf Coast states via rail. So there's a lot of steps involved in getting that seed down here. So we may not start getting some of the seed down here in late August, or maybe even be into September before we start seeing ryegrass seed at the co-ops and seed stores. Some other options for fall planting, if you're considering maybe planting something else besides ryegrass, you could maybe look at small grains such as oats, cereal rye, or wheat. Again, annual ryegrass is by far the most popular crop, but we do have a few producers that do plant some small grains. Now, I think most people plant annual ryegrass because among all the different winter forages, it's by far the easiest one to obtain a good stand with. Most of these other small grain crops have a little bit harder time getting stands established. And I think the reason for that is because if you look at the number of seeds per pound, all of these crops are much larger in terms of seed size compared to annual ryegrass. And all of these crops, small grain crops, need to be planted much deeper than annual ryegrass. We normally recommend with oats or wheat or rye, need to seed it at a depth of about 1 to 2 inches. You know, if you're used to overseeding ryegrass on the top of your sod and just lightly scratching it in, that is not going to work well at all with these small grain crops. Really, something like a no-till drill can be used for planting small grains like oats or wheat. Now, I know not everybody has a no-till drill, but there are some conservation districts that have these, and some co-ops or seed companies have these available that you can rent out. So it may be worth looking into. Now, if we compare some of these different small grain crops, oats has very high quality, and it's used to provide early grazing. It's not necessarily very winter hardy. So if we get some cold temperatures, it can be a winter kill pretty easily. Now, the large majority of people that plant oats are dairy producers, and they'll typically plant oats in early September because they want early grazing. You know, their summer pastures are typically going downhill that time of year, and the dairy producers need high quality forage, so they'll plant oats early. Also, a lot of wildlife food plots go in early September, and oats is a pretty major component of a lot of these different seed mixtures. And there are some good oat varieties available for forage. There's the Ram LA 99016 and the Ram Plot Spike oats were developed by the LSU wheat and oat breeder. And these have proven to be very good forage varieties for cattle producers. For wheat, wheat is more winter hardy than oats. We don't do any testing of forage varieties. So as far as a recommendation on wheat, you basically need a selective variety that does well for grain production in your area, and just go with that, because we really don't have any varieties that we can say produce more forage than others. And cereal rye tends to be considered very winter hardy, probably grown in the northern part of the state more so than the southern part of the state. And there are a handful of different cereal rye varieties available. Now, the cereal rye does mature earlier than ryegrass. And if you look at a comparison among these different small grains compared to ryegrass, you can see in the earlier months, say November or January, they typically will produce a little bit more than ryegrass does. But look what happens when we get into the spring months, April and May in particular. Ryegrass it's the time of year is when it really shines is later on in the spring, whereas a lot of these small grains are pretty well fading away. So one thing you may think about doing is planting at one area of your winter pasture acreage to a small grain like oats for early grazing, and then plant another area of your winter pasture acreage to annual ryegrass, just to kind of spread the cost out a little bit. And also the oats will give you early grazing, and the ryegrass will give you some late spring grazing. Just something to maybe consider. So when should your winter pasture be planted? On a prepared seed bed. With ryegrass, I normally recommend about September 20th. Normally you go much earlier than that. It's a lot of hot weather. You can have issues with with blast disease or maybe armyworms. Now, oats can be planted a little bit earlier to provide early grazing. And if you're going to be overseeding over your summer sod about mid-October, it is the best time to look at planting. Now, we put together a list of suggested varieties of cool season crops, including ryegrass and oats. And we've sent these out to your local extension agent. We put together a publication with the different varieties, and that should be available soon. The publication's done. I just don't think it's up on the website yet. But we do annual ryegrass variety testing at 3 locations around the state, and all that data will be available at that website soon. Or again, you can check with your local extension agent, because we have sent that data out to them. Now, just to kind of finish up here, I know as we head into the winter, many producers may not look at planting ryegrass or stockpiling forages or something like that. They're going to be looking at overwintering their herd with hay and supplements. And I'll just kind of give a plug for the next seminar, which I know Mr. Andrew Granger is going to be talking about winter feeding strategies. There's going to be a lot of different variables to consider. Hopefully, in a month from now, we'll have maybe a little better handle on how much hay is available, what the hay quality is looking like, what the cost of ryegrass seed is looking like, fertilizer cost, fuel cost, supplement cost. I think producers are really going to have to get out a sharp pencil here this fall and figure out what's going to be their most cost-effective options as far as winter feeding strategies for their cow herd this winter. But again, I guess kind of my take-home message for my talk here today is really try to optimize the efficient use of your summer pasture during the next few months. You know, do some fertilization, maybe some grazing management to try to stretch that pasture you have to its fullest extent, because I think the pasture is going to be the cheapest cost of your forage resource, and so far we've got a pretty good quality pasture resource out there. So try to maximize the use of it the best you can. And with that, that's all I have. I'll be glad to take any questions anybody might have.
All right, thank you, Dr. Twidwell. So we do have one question in the Q&A. And again, if y'all have any questions, you still have time to get those into the Q&A box or text to me. So the question that I see right now is, can you please go over the timing between steps for making baleage between cutting to wrapping it?
Okay, well, typically with ryegrass baleage, what they'll normally recommend doing is, say, cut one afternoon, and it can be ready for baling the next day. Typically, it can be anywhere from 12 to 24 hours drying time is really all you need for annual ryegrass, and then it can be baled. And then ideally, you would also do the wrapping soon after the baling process as possible. Now, one of the issues we run into with the summer grasses are that they can get below that moisture content level. We're looking at 45 to 60% moisture. They can get lower than that immediately. So that's one of the issues with the summer grasses, are that they can almost get too dry too fast. So again, that's one of the issues with the summer grasses. But again, typically with annual ryegrass, you can cut one afternoon and you'll be ready to bale it the next day.
Do you mind going over, so I know our extension agents can help them come dry and determine the moisture content before they wrap it, but do you mind talking about how they could test the moisture content of those before they wrap it, or even before they bale their hay?
Well, I know at the Southeast Research Station, where they did a lot of work with ryegrass baleage, they typically would use a microwave oven to determine the moisture content. That's probably the most accurate. You take a small sample and weigh it wet, and then you can dry it down in a microwave oven, and there's a formula you can use to calculate the moisture content. That's probably the most accurate, but it is a little time consuming. Now they do have some moisture meters on the market now that can handle these high moisture crops. That's probably another avenue to consider. I know a lot of the moisture meters that you typically just stick in a windrow are not very accurate when it comes to these high moisture crops. So if you're going to purchase a moisture meter, make sure it's one that's designed that can handle a high moisture type of forage.
Thank you. Yeah, and if y'all, if you need help determining moisture levels, if you need help sampling your forages or sampling your soils, you can always reach out to your local extension office and they'll point you to an agent that can help you do that. So we do have that available. So you still have a few minutes to go ahead and get questions into the Q&A. Dr. Twidwell, I'm going to take over the screen for a second to show them. Hopefully y'all can see my PowerPoint here. So we do ask that you please take a few minutes to complete our survey. This is just a general survey over the webinar today. It also allows you to give us some tips and things that you would like to hear from us in terms of our webinar series moving forward into the future. So there's a couple ways you can do this. Whether you're watching this live now or if you're watching the recording of this later, you can open the camera on your phone. With the camera, you view this little QR box over on the right. You'll see a banner pop up at the top, and you can click that little banner and it'll take you straight to the survey. I am also going to link the survey in the video and podcast descriptions for this webinar as well. And we do use these to be able to continue on with our Beef Brunch Educational Series. So if you please don't mind, again, it takes 2 to 3 minutes to go in and do that. And then I'm going to come back in just a second so y'all don't leave me yet. But as I mentioned earlier, we are going to post these as a recording. So if you want to go back and watch them, you can. You can find them on our website, lsuagcenter.com/beef brunch. That also has all the information on our upcoming webinars and a few of our past webinars as well, and our news updates. You can also find them all on our LSU AgCenter livestock channel on YouTube as well. So let me pop back in and see if we have any. I don't see any more questions. So Dr. Twidwell, thank you again for your time this morning, and thank all of you for joining us. As I just said, we're going to post this online. It'll take me about a week or so to get it up for you to be able to view on our website or in the podcast, listen to it in podcast form as well. And lastly, if you have any questions regarding the Beef Brunch Educational Series, you can always reach out to me. My email is akedwards@agcenter.lsu.edu, and I'll put that in the video and podcast descriptions as well. So thank you all, and we hope you have a great day.